And so as the state affiliate of our national program, we really work here in Arizona to reduce the stigma associated with mental illness. And we do that by helping people learn about, all the facets of mental health. And so we have educational efforts, which include informing and guiding not only the community, but also our public officials, healthcare providers, family members, teachers, whomever, knowing that we all have mental health and we want to take care of that health the same as our physical health. We want to be able to provide education and training on issues and topics that impact our community. And so one of the opportunities that I want to share with you is we have an online mental health screening tool. And so if you haven't checked out our website, again, I'll put it in the chat box there, and you have it, you have my email as well if you have any questions. But you can go online and we offer a free online confidential mental health screening. And there's a variety of different screening tools that you can select from. So anywhere from depression and anxiety to psychosis, bipolar, PTSD, addiction. There's a work health survey, a caregiver survey. And it's really an opportunity for individuals who feel they may be struggling with some type of mental health condition to recognize symptoms before stage 4. And at Mental Health America of Arizona, we use that term before stage 4 in a similar way that we would talk about physical health. So if somebody had a concern, maybe they found a lump in their breast, it's unlikely that an individual would wait until it's possibly stage 4 cancer before they would go to the doctor. And so we really, promote that early identification, the early detection, and early intervention. And so this screening tool serves as an opportunity for individuals to go in and maybe get a quick snapshot of their mental health. And then the results indicate whether or not, they are experiencing symptoms of a mental illness. And it provides some information about how they can share that information with their doctor, with their family, so that they can then further, get a full assessment. And then it also helps connect folks to resources that are in their area. So again, the surveys are short, they're online, they're free, they're confidential. So please share that with your colleagues and the individuals that you serve. I am thrilled today to introduce our presenters to you. And before I pass it over to Angie, who's going to get us started, I also did want to mention that the Mental Health America of Arizona, we have our SEEDS conference, which is going to be coming up on October 7th. So I'll be sure to include information about that to all of the participants today. We have moved it into the virtual space, which is a first time for us. So we're really excited to, be able to connect and stay joined with our colleagues and our peers in this different wave of navigating COVID-19 and some of that social isolation that comes along with that. So we look forward to having, an online space where we can provide great presenters and share information and network and kind of collaborate in that virtual world. So we certainly hope that you'll join us. I'm going to introduce both presenters, and then I will hand it over to Angie. Angie Geren is a community development specialist and polarity therapist committed to changing the conversation surrounding substance use and mental health by empowering individuals and connecting communities to become recovery ready through a trauma-informed lens. Angie's own struggle with addiction, family experiences, and education gives her a multifaceted and unique perspective, which has inspired her to lobby for public health focused on addiction policy, expand peer support, advocate for parents, and those in active addiction and recovery alike, and organize educational events. Angie is the founder of Arizona Recovers, a recovery community organization which provides harm reduction-based peer support, community and prevention, and also project director of Arizona Adverse Childhood Experience Consortium. So we'll be hearing from her first, and following that, we are privileged to hear from Doreen Nicholas. And Doreen is the Domestic Violence Response Manager at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Doreen has over 40 years of experience, both personally and as a worker in the anti-sexual and domestic violence movements. Doreen served as the executive board of the Arizona South Asians for Safe Families from 2004 to 2019, is a faculty member of the Arizona Victim Assistance Academy, and regularly works with the National Organization for Victim Assistance. She works to assist communities to better provide a comprehensive, flexible, compassionate response to domestic and sexual violence. Ms. Nicholas does community trainings on the local, state, and national level, and one time internationally. So I hope you all can join me in welcoming these fantastic presenters. At this time, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Angie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Erin. Looks like went to talk and realized that I'm still muted. So good morning, everyone. I am going to just share my screen real quick. And wait. My computer is a little slow. 1 second. There we go. Here we go. Erin, can you see that? Is it all shared?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Angie Geren. I am founder of Arizona Recovers and project director for the Arizona ACEs Consortium. And when Erin gave my bio, you know, I hear the words changing the conversation, which obviously I've been using quite a bit since it's in my mission statement, all of that. And I was thinking, I wonder if people really understand what that means about changing the conversation. And it's really in line with Mental Health America's, philosophy of that before stage 4. We talk about everything as, when things are in crisis, and we rarely talk about things before that stage, right? Like, what does that look like in early intervention? What does that look like when we're in the middle, of things, and we're in the early stages, we're in the middle stages. We always wait until kind of the late stages. And I think, when, the first time doing this presentation, cleaning our trauma colored glasses and healing ourselves before helping others, that was really the catalyst behind it, because we get to the point, right, that we don't intervene until stage 4. And so the majority of us is what I have found, especially in the healing and the helping professions, and teachers, first responders, all of that, is we all have a personal story. We have an emotional attachment to the outcome of what that's going to look like. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in that helping profession, right? Like, we're not in it for the money. We're not out to make millions of dollars. I mean, we're not even out to make hundreds of thousands of dollars. Let's just be honest. We have professions that are very long work. They're very understaffed usually, and there's a lot of stress that goes along with our jobs, but we do them because we want to make a difference. And the reason we want to make a difference is because there is something within us, whether it has been a personal experience of our own or personal experiences of other people that have been around us, our community, our friends, but we have some sort of emotional attachment. And that's what drives our passion. That's why we do what we do. And unfortunately, we don't ever talk about how that personal story affects how we interact with others, and what that actually looks like in practice, where we're coming. And so our presentation will go from, just talking about what trauma is, and how that looks in our lives, what that looks like when we're helping other people, how we can maybe recognize what the signs and symptoms of us being within our own trauma response, and then how we can respond to all of that. I do right now have the chat up. So if you have any questions throughout, please put it in the chat. Erin's also going to be monitoring that chat box for us, and we'll try to take routine breaks throughout it for questions. It's a little bit different right on this Zoom platform, and really understanding that, in listening to this presentation and, Doreen's presentation after ours, that talking about trauma in and itself can be triggering. And if that is the case, and if you feel that, those emotions are coming up, I do, integrate some of my personal story and examples into this. And if you feel that that has triggered you emotionally in any way, please reach out to your support system. If you feel that you don't have one, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end. Or I know Erin and Doreen feel the same way. So with that said, let's get started. What is trauma? By definition, trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And then an example of personal trauma, like the death of a child. By definition, it almost feels like it is just an experience, right, that we can easily define. We can easily say, oh, that was deeply distressing and disturbing. That death of a loved one, abuse, those things, we can say that's trauma. And our brain easily recognizes that is trauma, and that could possibly have an effect on us, right? But when we actually look at what trauma is, if we look at it in the biological sense, as far as what does that look like going on in my body? What are the processes in my brain? What are some of those things that we come to? Really what trauma is anything that overwhelms the brain's ability to cope. So anything that overwhelms the brain's ability to cope. Yesterday, I heard a presenter that had said it is too much too fast. And I thought that is a great explanation of trauma, right? Everybody has an individual system. And our individual systems, things react differently to us, right? Depending on so many different factors. And trauma really is the body's response to anything that overwhelms our ability to cope, or that too much too fast at that time. And so when we kind of look at trauma in that lens of where it's at, right, it opens that door. It opens explanation and that conversation around what does consist of trauma, and what does that look like. We all, understand that traumatic events are trauma, right? What we don't talk about a lot is how that process is different in different people's bodies. For example, I have 4 biological kids. They are currently 21, 20, 17, and 8. And when my 21-year-old and my 17-year-old were 16 and 12, my 16-year-old son was driving. He took his sister to run an errand, and they were about to go out to lunch. And they were in a car accident, and they totaled the van. And their experiences were completely and totally different, right? My son, as the driver of the vehicle, experienced the accident in one way. My daughter, as 12-year-old passenger, experienced it a completely other way. And even though they both had the exact same traumatic event, the response to that, the way that it processed within their body, was completely and totally different. So my son got up for work the next morning at 4:30 in the morning, like he always did, and he went to work, and it seemed to not really have as much of an impact, at least emotionally and psychologically, as it did on my daughter. My daughter, to this day, has the passenger seat, if she's driving with anyone, all the way up as far as you can go, which is completely unsafe. But she needs to be able to see the road in front of her over the hood. for months afterwards, she would put headphones and she would turn up the music as loud as she could so she couldn't hear the background noise of the traffic. You know, that was the way that traumatic event affected her, right? There was a longer lasting impact. To this day, she still will only drive. She has her license herself, so she, you know, she drives and she'll drive with me. But she still refuses to drive with her brother, and it's really hard for her to drive with anybody else without igniting that kind of anxiety and trauma response within her. And so kind of looking at that as far as, you know, the traumatic events of what that kind of looks like, we really need to expand our view of recognizing that trauma is an experience, you know, a personal experience, and what that does in our body, you know, outside of what the actual event is. Other examples of trauma that we're talking about are adverse childhood experiences. If you are not familiar, adverse childhood experience is a study that was done by the CDC, Dr. Folletti, and Kaiser Permanente in the 90s. And that looked at 10 different events that would have happened in a child's life before they turned 18. They broke those traumas up into two different categories. One being, you know, a personal category like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, and then the next one being household dysfunction. So how did that household, how was the household that child lived in, right? Was there substance use disorder in that household? Did they live with somebody who had a mental illness? Did they live with somebody who had faced incarceration? You know, they looked at those specific categories, I should say, of trauma. And it was just a simple 10 question questionnaire that was yes or no answer. And the highest score you could get was a 10, the lowest score you could get was a 0. And you just said you got a point for every yes that you had experienced in yours. And what they found out from that study was that the more adverse childhood experiences that child had before the age of 18, the more likely they were for every physical and behavioral and mental health issue that a person could have as an adult. And it was really important to understand that, because it really shows that long lasting impact of trauma, right? And how that looks within our body system, and then also within the way that we behave with other people, the way that we have relationships, what that looks like for us. And how that looks like as far as our trauma responses, right? And recognizing that when we're in a trauma response, we are perpetuating that same trauma, at least in our system, right? We're feeling those kinds of same feelings, and understanding that that does impact our body and our brain and the way that we look at it. Other trauma is complex trauma. You know, that is that long acting trauma. You know, my kid's car accident was a one-time event, right? If there was a car accident over and over and over and over and over again in their life, you're looking at that more complex trauma. We have a longer, we have a longer time frame and a longer time span of what that looks like, right? And then you have the other different factors that kind of go into it. So if you have multiple abuses, multiple different events that are happening at the same time, how does that look in your life? Post-traumatic stress disorder is is your body's response, right, to that trauma, and how that looks. And remembering that, you know, when we're talking about the trauma response, when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, when we automatically kind of go back into that trauma, we have to understand that the same biological experiences that you had in that initial trauma are happening in that moment again. And so we're kind of further deepening that trauma, if that makes sense. And then vicarious trauma. seeing other people experience, hearing their stories, all of those things, that weighs on us, right? That's something that we are experiencing. It may not be the experience itself, but we are experiencing other people's traumas and we're being present for them, we're listening to them, or hearing their stories. All of that has an effect on us, right? All of that is responding in our body in some way. And really, looking at where we're at right now in society with COVID-19, the collective stress and collective trauma that is happening right now is quite palpable. When COVID first happened, I would talk to my fiance about the difference of going into the grocery store, right? Where you would be able to go in the grocery store and you would be able to smile at somebody and they would smile back. You'd say hello and they would say hello back. And when COVID, first hit, there was so much fear. There was so much collective fear in society that when you would go to the grocery store and, experience people that sometimes, you'd smile at them and they would just nothing. There was no response at all, right? Or you'd say hello and they'd kind of back up a bit because we were just in so much fear. Well, those things are all impacting us at the time that it's gone. And then the longer we have that, those experiences happening around us, the more effect it has on our system and the way that we look at this world and the way that we kind of behave in the world. And the same thing is for, historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, the oppression, the poverty, there's so many different things that go into it that we really need to kind of expand that understanding of what that looks like in our life, right? And how is that personally affecting? Does anybody have any questions? Erin, for some reason, I cannot pull up the chat on my end. But does anybody have any questions about trauma and what that looks like as far as expanding that kind of languaging around it?
Right now, Angie, we don't have anything in the chat box. So if folks do have questions, now is a great time. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay. So when we're looking at trauma and substance use disorder, trauma and mental health, what we see is we have a greater likelihood of developing substance use disorder and mental health disorders. And I think that isn't a far stretch for people to understand that connection, right? I think what it is sometimes is we just don't understand how much it is, right? So over 2/3 of people seeking treatment for substance use disorder, over 2/3 report one or more traumatic life events. And we're looking at just life events, right? We're not looking at what that community looked like around it. We're not, we're not looking at the little, at the toxic stress that kind of builds up along within our lives. We're looking at just what those events are. And persons with an ACE score of 5 or more are 5 to 7 times more likely to use substances. They're also 100 times more likely. No, they're 30 times more likely to attempt suicide. Those are big, huge numbers. Those are really big, huge numbers. And understanding, so when we're working with people with mental health and substance use disorder, we need to understand that they have most likely experienced trauma in their life, and they are most likely responding with their trauma response. And I make that distinction because when it comes to us helping ourselves first before we can help others, we really need to understand that everyone around us, including ourselves, are coming from our own past, right, and our own story. and our own natural responses to that, right? So it doesn't make a difference whether you had substance use disorder, whether you're in recovery, even sometimes, a lot of the trauma work that you have done, right? If you've been in therapy for years, and you've really looked at what trauma has done within your own life, what your own story, how that has impacted you, and you've responded to it, there are still some things that are really ingrained in us and become kind of that automatic process, right? That we end up responding to. And those are the things that, that we're really kind of going to be talking about today. And when I talk about, how our automatic responses, right? We really need to understand how the brain works and what kind of trauma looks like, I guess you'd say, within that brain, what the different functions are. So, within our brain, we have the amygdala, which is like that little computer and alarm system that says, whoa, there's danger. We need to do something about that, right? And that we need to do something about that equates into releasing hormones into our body, and how that looks like. That whole entire computer is the one that kind of translates that information to us, so that way our body knows how to respond. And our hippocampus is where our brain stores most of our recent conscious memories. And one thing that's really important to understand is that hippocampus, when it has been faced with trauma, it doesn't store the memories in correct chronological order. It kind of takes snapshots of what it is and tries to process it and put it in the correct box. When things are too much, too fast, that part of our brain doesn't have that time and that space, because it's so busy responding, because the amygdala has set off that alarm, that it's incorrectly categorizing the memories, and it's incorrectly taking a snapshot, like almost like a blurry snapshot of what happened, instead of a crisp, clear snapshot, if that makes sense. And then the thalamus translates the sights, sounds, smells in the language of the brain. And that's important to understand, because when we're thinking of trauma response and we're thinking of, how that affects us, we all know that our triggers can be any of that. It can be the sight of it. We can have the sound of it. It can be a smell. Whenever I think of the smell, triggering something, it doesn't always have to be bad, right? My 17-year-old daughter, when she was in preschool, she went to the same preschool for like 2 years. I think she was like 3 and 4 that she went to this preschool. And we were somewhere at a gas station or out in public, and she was about 14, 15 at the time. And she goes to wash her hands and she goes, oh, this smells just like my preschool soap. And I'm like, your preschool soap? Like that was over a decade ago, but that smell was part of her memory, and her being triggered that is what that preschool soap smelled, went into this whole entire story of how it was when she was in preschool and the different things that she did when she was in preschool. And our body has that same memory, right? Whether it is something good or it is something bad. And then our prefrontal cortex is where, we make those decisions. We make those logical and rational decisions. And it's really really important to understand that when we are in a trauma response, we are unable to use that prefrontal cortex, right? We do not process information the exact same way, because we're using the amygdala that's sounding that alarm. And so we're unable to actually access this part of the brain. And it's really important to understand when we're in a trauma response what we're responding from, because then it helps us to understand some strategies to not respond from that place, right? So we can bring ourselves back into that prefrontal cortex. I'm going to go on to the next slide, and then I'll stop and ask questions. So if there's any questions that you have around this, please put it in the chat box. So when we're talking about that amygdala, right, from this limbic system of this lower brain functions and take over, that's where we turn more into that survival mode, right? And it looks different for everyone, and it also looks different for the different events that you're having. So most people have one of the things that's their automatic, right? A fight, flight, or freeze. But almost everybody experiences all of them in different situations. I was always a runner. My first thing was just to run, like leave whatever that situation. My, response was flight. If something is happening to my children and it's triggering something that's happening to my children, my first response is fight. Right? That's where my brain's automatic, warning sign goes off, and it is like just roar into the whole entire thing. But then there's also things that if I'm too scared, I will completely freeze, and I will shut down, and what that looks like in my system, and understanding that we all experience these in different times, and understanding what that looks like when we experience. So what does your fight look like? What does your flight look like? What does your freeze look like? How do those present in your life? And what exactly does that look like? My freeze, when there is so many, where there's a lot of emotion around me and I'm not sure how to process it, I get very quiet. And all of a sudden my normal tone of my voice is now about here, and my speech slows down and my tone slows down, and it's like I can't actually access that kind of normal speech that I'm used to, right? That is where my body kind of goes into that freeze response. And me understanding that helps me to understand when my body is in an automatic process, that something really is going on, and it's kind of like my warning sign, like, ooh, that's not good, or that is just what it is, but that I need to kind of address it. Are there any questions around the trauma in the brain, and then fight, flight, or freeze?
At this time, we don't have anything in the chat box, Angie.
Thank you. Sorry, Erin, that for some reason it will not come up on my system.
Not a problem.
Okay, now the physical impact of trauma, right? Like, what does that physical impact look like in your life? When we talked about, trauma being something that overwhelms our brain's ability to cope, right? And that it releases all of these hormones, understanding that physical impact looks different for everybody. And these are some of the different ways that it can impact you. Echotraining.org has amazing resources on their website when it comes to responding to somebody who has suffered trauma, like really kind of concrete examples. I really love their PDFs for anybody who wants more information on that. But, looking at these hormones, right, the prolonged high cortisol, it creates a greater reactivity to stress. And that long term, my screen just went black. Erin?
Angie, are you able to hear me?
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay, my screen just went totally, completely black.
Okay, let's.
Did my camera go out?
Yes.
Strange.
What I can try doing is, do you want to try stop sharing and then
Oh,
share?
my screen is completely black. I
Oh,
can't.
so you can't see anything at all.
Nothing. Nothing at all.
Okay. I can pull up your PowerPoint and share it for you, but you won't necessarily know what slide that is.
Right. Right. Well, you know what? Let me pull it. How funny. Let me pull it up on my phone. And that is really weird. This is a brand new computer. I'm having supercomputer issues lately. Okay, let me pull.
You can try that. Or if it works for you, we can also, take a minute or two to break if you need to do a reboot and rejoin. That's okay too.
If you can click through, as long as you can hear me, that's completely fine. I will pull my presentation up and do it from here.
Okay.
I'll just have to let you know when to click over.
Okay, not a problem. All righty, let me go ahead and pull it up here. All right. Thanks, folks, for hanging in there with us.
Yeah, so sorry.
Not a problem. Angie, what slide? So we were just on.
We were on slide 9.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Alrighty. And are you able to see this okay on your end?
I can see my presentation. I can't see anything.
Oh, that's right.
Screen. Yeah.
Doreen, do you mind chiming in and letting me know that you can see this okay on your end?
I cannot see it. There's a black screen.
Oh, is it because it's sharing mine?
That could be. So if you turn off share, Angie.
Yeah, but I can't see my screen to turn off share.
So,
I think you might need to log out and log back in, Angie.
Okay. I will be right back. Hopefully.
Let's give that a try. And folks, why don't we just take a few minutes, refill your coffee, self-care, stand, stretch, do a quick breathing activity, and we'll get started back up in just a few minutes. Thanks.
Woo! Alrighty, look at that event. Almost too much for my brain to handle, but we got it on there. So when we're looking at, like the different kinds of impacts that trauma can have, it's really important to understand that there are just so many different ways that it can actually look like in your life. And if this PDF here, right, is on that echotraining.org if you wanted to have a copy of it yourself. Okay. Really important to understand that we as humans, it is just how it is that we see through our past experiences and we only know what we know, right? And that understanding that all of the events in our life have led up to this moment that we are in right now. And that there's many different ways that we can be kind of triggered really, and that our body is going to look at it in a different way. Knowing that trauma response is very vocal. However, many of us don't realize what it is, and we don't have that conversation, right, of what that kind of looks like outside of that fight, flight, or freeze. Like, that's great, but what does that actually look like in our system, right? We need to understand that every human is hardwired for survival. all of these processes that our body and our brain has created around us, they are all for survival. And the brain says, whoa, this is too much. I can't handle this at this moment, right? It's too much. It's too fast. I need to figure it out, and I need to categorize it. And there are some things that, that now I need to remember that this experience happened. Remember that it was I experienced it as a dangerous situation because my brain's body, it superseded the capacity, right? And because I'm hardwired for survival, I now need to create a process around that. And I now need to create a way to respond to it in order to keep me safe, if that makes sense. And understanding that it's our responsibility to recognize when we're responding from that place, right? And understand what we can do for that. What are some responses to that, right? What does that look like in our system, right? What are some of the cues that we can think of? Some of the physical response cues, nauseous, tightness of chest, a heavy feeling, and kind of, that heavy feeling that you get in your chest, like, ooh, something is, going on. Pain is our body's number one way to communicate to us. Our body has a voice, and it talks to us through that pain, right? A knot in that stomach. What does your physical response look like? How does that look like in your system? And then emotional responses, just examples of that: crying, anger, anxiety, fear, outbursts, quietness, right? When I'm in my freeze thing, my thing is to kind of shut down, and I get very quiet. That is a trauma response cue for me. And then what does that kind of look like when you are in life, right? Can I please fast forward? There you go. What does that look like in personal interactions? What does it look like when you're in a trauma response, or maybe what is your body's warning sign to you that you're in overwhelm, right? Like that's another important thing for us to understand is where are we getting to overwhelm? Because if we are in overwhelm, that's when we're more likely to respond that automatically, if that makes sense. And what that kind of looks like as far as within personal interactions, if we are actually responding from our own things, right? It kind of looks like upset with someone else's behavior, anger with someone's lack of progress, critical of other people's responses, right? And why is that? That's because that's hitting something within us of that memory, right? We want people to do better, right? We want people to be happy. We want people to experience life in a way that is amazing, right? We don't want to see people hurt. We don't want to see people in pain. And when we're looking at the way that their behavior is, if we're upset with what they're doing within their own life, that's because it is actually triggering something within us. We have a memory of something, right? That has been our pain, that has been our sadness, that has been our hurt. Those have been our mistakes. And especially when we're thinking of parenting and how we look at our children, right? When we're upset with their behavior in a way, a lot of times it goes back to how was it when we were a child, and how did people respond to us when we were in that way? Are those the pieces that we're critical of ourselves on? And are we critical of ourselves because we have a personal memory that's attached to that pain, sadness, fear, anger, right? How does that look within within your personal life. Kind of statements that a lot of times come out of that. What were you thinking? Why don't you understand? You just need to. You really should. Understanding that when we are judging a behavior that way, that we are judging it from our own lens, and it is also from our own experiences, right? Because we only see through our experiences and the ones that we've had. And then flipping that, like, what does that look like to have a healed response? What does that look like? So, we've experienced a lot of things in our lives. I remember that I used to say, I live on a need to know basis, and I need to know everything, and I need to know it now, until I started having all of these experiences. And all of a sudden my brain went, okay, you know what, Angie, I think we've experienced enough. We can stop saying that. We would like to have another perception, and we'd like to have another experience of that. And then, I come from, my ACE score is a 6. And that was just before 18, right? And if you actually added the things that have happened in my adult life, up until, just in my adult life, it is a little bit, off the kind of ACEs scale. And understanding that everything that I had done, every relationship that I had had, every interaction with other people that I have had, I was primarily responding directly as a trauma response. The way that I responded to others was very hurtful to them. And it was very hurtful to me, right? And it all came out of that fear and that kind of survival instinct that I was in. And then once I recognized that and started taking care of my personal traumas and my past traumas, then we were able to kind of respond in an entirely different way, right? And what that looked like is really having that kind of non-judgmental, open, safe, compassionate response for others, and understand that we do all have our own personal story. And if that is true for me, if I am responding from my past stories and the stories that I've told myself, if I'm responding in an automatic way to the things that have happened to me, and it's my brain's and my body's survival mechanism to help me move forward in life, I need to understand that other people are in that exact same space. And so kind of what does that look like, and what does that healed response look like for us, right? And understanding that we really can't help others when we're in our own trauma response. Think about a time that you were, that you were really upset. Something had happened, somebody had done something, whatever it was, and you were just in that really upset space. Do we think rationally and logically at that time? Right? Are we able to be like, ooh, I'm really upset because, like, and I mean, in that moment, right? In that moment when it first happens, we need to understand that, we're not using that kind of prefrontal cortex of our brain in that moment. And so our help to others, especially when we're talking in, the healing and the helping professions, our response to others, we're not going to be able to respond in that open, not, that safe and non-judgmental way if we are actually responding from our own trauma. So what can we do in the moment when we're in that? So we have recognized that, this, this may be my stuff, right? I may be upset because of this. Being a spectator of our own thoughts is one of the most critical things that we can do. Because if we don't understand where our thoughts are, it makes it really difficult to recognize what our triggers are, right? When I was first dating my fiance, he said something to me, and it was like 4 words. And all of a sudden, and it triggered me. And out of absolute nowhere, all of a sudden I went from everything was fine and everything was happy and we were like just having a conversation to, I need space. I can't have this conversation right now. And it took me, quite a bit of, 20 minutes for me to actually recognize what was going on. Right. It like caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting it. And so then I started looking at like, well, what are those thoughts that are around it? Where is that coming? And realizing that though the statement that he made was actually a trigger to me from my past, right? Those things happen, whether we have gone through therapy and we thought we've dealt with it or not, because it is that kind of automatic response within our body, which is why it's so important that we actually understand what that response looks like in our system. So then we can actually use these responses, right? It allows you to say, I need to take a breath. I possibly need to take a timeout. I can tell you that I've taken more timeouts in my life than I've ever given my kids. Because what I have realized is that when their behavior is triggering me, it's because it is because I needed to take care of something within myself, right? And that if I could get out of that heightened state, that I could then respond in a much better way, right? And so taking that time out of being like, okay, I need a moment with this. I need to take a breath. I need to, be a spectator of my thoughts and see what that kind of looks like. And I need to vocalize it, right? Because of my past experiences, I may react out of emotion. However, I'll do my best to be present with you, right? In that moment of, okay, I recognize that I'm triggered. I see all these thoughts that I'm having around myself. I've, taken a breath, and now, excuse me. And now I need to let you know, and apologize if there was a reaction and not a response, right? I was my 4-year-old, he's 8. My 8-year-old has an entirely different response, has had entirely different experience than my older kids. I was actually in active addiction with my older kids until they were about 6, 5, and 2. My 8-year-old had me in recovery. So his automatic responses to things are a little bit different, actually a lot different, than my older kids because of that kind of foundational base that we've had. But that apologizing when we do react from emotion reminds me of the time it was just last year. Right? No matter how much work that I've done, we're still human. And there still are times that we are going to kind of react. And I was already, frustrated that day, and I was yelling at his sister and I got into a huge fight. And we were yelling back and forth. And I come to bed and my 8-year-old goes, Mom, I don't understand Caden's life. And I kind of looked at him and I was like, what? He's like, I don't understand Caden's life. Why is she getting in trouble? Why are you yelling at her? And I was like, well, she didn't listen. And he goes, oh, so it's your fault. You didn't manage your emotions properly. And I was like, okay, well, thank you for calling me out to the carpet on that. Not quite sure, how to respond. And then understanding I have reacted from emotion. You are right. I was reacting because I didn't like the way that it made me feel inside, which was my personal response, and then respond from that point forward, right? And apologizing for it. Sometimes I react out of emotion because I am scared, fear, right? Hurt. That makes me sad. That brings me back to this place. I am scared. I don't want that to happen to you again. I don't want those things to happen from you. Like those are how we're reacting from emotions, are completely and totally 100% valid, and something that every single human has. And understanding that any of this is just being human. We're just human. And so when we are in our most humanness, and when we are responding from things that have happened in the past that our brain has created a safety mechanism around, what can we do in that moment, right? And how does that look within us? So, just going over that again, that being that spectator of your own thoughts, recognizing your triggers, what does that look like? Taking a breath. Taking a breath actually has a physiological response. There are receptors at the bottom of your diaphragm that when oxygen hits it, it signals your brain to relax. There's a reason why we always say to take a deep breath. And taking a time out, letting them know that, this may be hard for me. I may respond. I may react when I want to respond. I will do my best, is really important. And what this kind of all does is kind of create that safety for others to be able to have that communication, be able to have that space, right? So what are some of the things that we can do on our own if we are recognizing that, hey, my past experiences are actually affecting my interactions a lot more than I thought they were. I'm reacting quite a bit and not responding as much as I would like to. We look for things, to be able to address that and to have that kind of intervention on that. Therapists that specialize in trauma, incredibly important. If you are ever going to address the trauma that had happened in your life, it is really important to seek out a therapist who actually understands trauma, because what can happen if we are seeing a therapist that doesn't understand trauma is they can open up that door to all of those things, and they're not going to know how to respond properly to them, which can then re-traumatize you, right? And can keep you in that trauma response. So it's really important if we're looking for a therapist to understand that. EMDR has shown absolutely amazing benefit to people to kind of reframe what is going on in that brain at the moment that have that automatic thing, as does hypnotherapy of having that. Meditation is one that I want to say with a caveat. If you have experienced heavy trauma, if you've experienced whatever trauma looks like in your life, right? Meditation can actually trigger a trauma response within you. And know that sometimes happens, and there's nothing wrong with you. For some people, it is not safe to close your eyes and go into a quiet state. And that is the exact thing that triggers you back into that memory. If that is you, please don't continue to try to do meditation because somebody told you that it was great to do for this. Please seek out another alternative. And once you've dealt with that kind of trauma that's actually triggering that response for you when you're doing the meditation, then try the meditation angle again if you would like, but understand that there is a caveat with that meditation. Trauma release exercises, there's a few therapists, at least in Arizona, I know across in the United States, that they are specific physical body exercises that you can do that helps release trauma that's trapped and stored in your body. Yoga is another thing that can be triggering. I say meditation and yoga with the caveat of understanding, because of the way that our body stores our memories, that we need to understand that, these things can actually trigger that response and how that responds. And then self-care. Self-care is one of our, number one things that we can do for ourselves. And Doreen is going to go into, that self-care a little bit more, actually a lot more, and how important it is, because as I'm sure that Doreen will reiterate, is self-care is the most important thing we can do when we are, for ourselves, especially if we have, experienced trauma. And self-care looks different for everybody. But, some of the things, I think that when we think of self-care, we really think of like, okay, well, what can I do for myself? Okay, I'll get my nails done. I'll get a massage, right? I'll go do something. But one of the best self-care pieces we can ever do is being kind to ourselves. Take care of yourself the way that you would want someone else to take care of you. Would you want somebody to berate you and put you down, and tell you that you're a terrible person? Would you want that person in your life taking care of you? You know, we need to be kind to ourselves, be mindful of our negative thoughts. And that's really kind of that best self-care you could possibly really ever give yourselves. And then I always say, whatever brings a smile to your face and your heart is self-care, right? What works for one doesn't work for another. Heavy metal music to me is not self-care. On an average day. Other kinds of music are, right? Hiking in the desert when it's 100 degrees outside, not too much self-care for me, but for other people, it is, right? And so kind of understanding that if whatever you're doing that somebody has said, oh, you need to try this for self-care. Massages, I do not like massages in any way, shape, or form. Most people look at me strange, like, what? But that's not something that actually brings a smile to my face and my heart. That's not self-care, right? So whatever that kind of is for you, really, that kind of fits in that category. Healing ourselves before helping others improves connection, it lessens resistance, and it strengthens all relationships, right? When we're able to understand, what does that process look like within our body? When am I in that space? What are some of the things that are warning signs to me of life may be a little bit too much and I'm not taking care of myself? Because that's when you're going to be more susceptible to those responses, right? Understanding all of that, and being able to recognize that kind of within your body, and taking and really showing kindness and compassion and love for your past experiences, getting to that point, so that way they can come from a healed response, affects every single thing you do, whether it be going to the grocery store, being with your kids, being at work. Again, if this, presentation has, triggered you in any way, if things are coming up, please reach out. I really like the quote from Brene Brown. I love Brene Brown. Offering help is courageous and compassionate, but so is asking for help. And, a lot of us in this industry, and dealing with any kind of mental health or behavioral health issues, we're really good at helping other people. We are not so good at helping ourselves, and asking for help is truly one of the most courageous and compassionate things that you can do for yourself. And I really like that quote, is you cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it, right? If we're always doing what we have always done, we will always get what we've always got. And really important to kind of understand that we can change that. There's my contact information if you need it. That number is my cell phone number. If you need, if this has triggered you in any way and you want to reach out, please feel free to text me, and we can set up a time to talk. With that said, are there any questions before I pass it over to Doreen?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Angie. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. And if folks have questions moving forward, as she said, you can feel free to continue typing them in the chat box or contact her directly. At this time, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Doreen Nicholas. And again, she's joining us from the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. So she'll go ahead and share her screen with us and we'll get started. Welcome, Doreen.
Hello. Okay. Oh, I think I did it. Yay.
You did it. I'm so incredibly impressed with your technology wisdom.
That's been a long time coming. So hopefully this conversation will spin up some questions for both Angie and I. I saw a couple familiar names on in the group here. So hi, everyone. I'm Doreen Nicholas. As Erin said, I work at the Coalition. I've done domestic violence work for a long time. So that's my email and my title. So I'm the domestic violence response manager here at the Coalition. But I'm also, I've experienced multiple sexual assaults, survived domestic violence. I'm a recovering addict and alcoholic. I've got 32 years sober, 33 years in September, a day at a time. I'm also a mother to my son, John, a grandmother to Nicholas, John, Michael, and Logan, and a great-grandmother to little Viviana Marie, as of last November. So I share that with you to demonstrate that we come into this work helping other people, many times not by mistake. And that the more we can be transparent with ourselves and with other people and not spend the energy just stuffing past traumatic events down, the healthier we're going to be and the more effective we're going to be in the work that we do. So, okay, I've got a little sound effects in here, and this is part of my self-care, is playing around with sound effects. So I'm going to do that again, okay? Okay, so when we talk about the lifespan of a advocate or a helper, somebody in the helping professions, a lot of times we start out, you know, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, we're going to fix everything and save everybody and change the world, right? As time goes on in those early days, a lot of times it starts to set in how hard this work is, how little resources we have. And, you know, like Angie said, you know, we don't do this to get rich, but damn, I at least want to buy groceries. When I started doing this work in 1990 at Sojourner Center, I was making $5 an hour, but I loved working with victims of violence. I actually had to get another job to be able to afford to work at Sojourner Center. But we realize those harsh realities of the work that we do. There's a lot of societal barriers. We aren't given the funding so we can have appropriate resources for people in need. Sometimes we work with folks that might have power issues or they haven't done their own healing. So a lot of times our work environments are really kind of toxic in and of themselves. And then with some of the stuff we experience and some of the stuff that we hear and the way people talk about people in need, sometimes we get really confused, like, what the heck did I walk into? If we've got a real power trippy boss or it's a toxic environment and there's a lot of infighting and competition and those kind of things, sometimes it doesn't feel safe to speak up. So we feel silenced, and that's never good and never healthy for anyone, whether they've experienced trauma or not. So some of us get angry, some of us feel kind of crazed. And if something doesn't change or we don't develop good coping skills, if our trauma is triggered and we're not doing our own self-healing, we either get out or we burn out or we get thrown out. We either quit or we're fired, right? And we are very needed in our communities. So one, it's important that we take care of ourselves. Two, that we're part of developing a healthy work environment. Our past traumas, if we don't deal with it, and this was right in my face when I started working with domestic violence victims. You know, I figured I was 3 years clean and sober when I started doing this work. I was just starting to do the internal work on why I drank and used. And it was coming face to face with the abuse that I had experienced in my life since I was 2 years old. The abusive marriage that I barely got out of. That stuff was right in my face on a daily basis. And I needed early on to learn how to separate that from what the victims that I was working with were going through. I had to figure out how to compartmentalize, how to put it aside, how to be totally present for that person. But if we don't address our own past trauma, any vicarious trauma we have, the vicarious trauma and burnout, it's amplified. And it can really cloud our perceptions of others. It can trigger us. That damages our effectiveness. Projection, transference, countertransference, all those things can occur. I would take things real personally really quick. It was hard for me to be objective. I would go home from work really drained emotionally and physically. I would work more than my schedule allowed for because my lens at that time was, you know, if I can help these people, if I can quote unquote fix these people, I can fix myself. I didn't know I was thinking that at the time, but I had a really good supervisor who was watching and listening to me, and she shared that information with me. And it was a really tough conversation, but it was so helpful. So I really stepped up my own personal counseling and therapy, my recovery meetings and those kind of things until I could effectively compartmentalize and separate what had gone on with me as opposed to what was going on with the people that I served. And it's really important to, you know, like Angie mentioned, what do those triggers look like? How do we know when those past experiences show up? And you know, for those of you that are trying to be stoic and you know you're moving forward and doing this work with your degree or your training as your shield, you'll be able to do that for a while. But the reality is that we have to come to terms with what we've gone through. We spend a lot of energy keeping that stuff down, energy that could be better used for our own health, self-healing, which makes us more effective. But look, what do your triggers look like? Do you know what they are? I know I go from 0 to outraged when it feels like an injustice has occurred. Sometimes it's connected to something I've gone through, but I get this twinge in my gut and it feels like an arrow goes straight to my brain and my head gets hot. So that is a signal for me that I need to take a breath and step back, take as long as I need so I can respond as opposed to reacting. It took me a long time to develop that muscle because I would just react and pop off and it took a long time. But you need to know what that feels like, what that looks like when you're being triggered so that you can manage that and don't harm this vulnerable person that's in front of you that you're working with. Tools to be more effective. This is an example of one of the things that I share when I train advocates. We'll get to the Etch-a-Sketch in a minute. But, you know, get therapy if you need it. Find a mentor who understands and can guide you through dealing with personal trauma and how to translate that and to be effective in your work with other people who've been traumatized. If you see a lot of people during the day or you're on a lot of phone calls during the day or you have a lot of meetings and things going on, make sure that you have some kind of grounding exercise before and between interactions with people that you serve or meetings or whatever. And that's what this Etch-a-Sketch is about. Erin, I want you to check the chat box, but how many of you have your own Etch-a-Sketch or happily played with one as a child? And put your answers in the chat box, please. I can't see mine either, so Erin, let me know.
It's okay. I'll keep an eye on it. So far, I'm not seeing anything, but I'm
Nobody had an Etch-a-Sketch?
people are pausing. Oh, here we go. Love those. Happily played with one as a child. Rosie shared that Rosie had one as well.
Okay.
Yep, we're getting lots of connection with that Etch-a-Sketch.
Etch-a-Sketch.
Or
Okay.
had one. Olivia shared that had that, uses it, and Play-Doh. Yep, so certainly all in this together, Doreen. Great example.
Okay. Well, the coordinators that work with me got me an Etch-a-Sketch for Christmas this last year. And I was so happy. And it's actually one of my training props, because if you remember how an Etch-a-Sketch works, and you might have to go home and steal one from your kids and play with it a minute just to remind yourself. But you know, you draw something on it, and then if you are done with that and you want to draw something else, you shake the screen. So I'm suggesting that you come up with some kind of an activity. Doesn't need to be any more than a minute or two. That between the clients that you work with, between the phone calls that you take, between the meetings, you might have a meeting with staff, and then you might have a crisis call. Between each of those incidents, have some kind of an activity that you do, even if it's walking around your desk twice, or stretching, or going to get a cup of coffee, or whatever. Something where you can clear your screen. You might see me shaking my hands like I'm shaking an Etch-a-Sketch, but I don't want you, though, to be shaking your head around to clear that screen. We don't want to get any brain injury going on here. But something that you can tangibly do, so that when you're done with this meeting, you know you are going to talk to a client in 5 minutes. Something that you can do that'll clear your screen from the meeting, if you will, so you can be totally present for that crisis call or that client that you're meeting with. And when you can do things like that, you're starting to develop a really strong self-care program. And you know, it's a lot more, self-care is a lot more than what Glamour magazine tells us. Like Angie said, it's not just a bubble bath or a manicure. It's anything that gives you joy, makes you happy, keeps you in touch with yourself, brings a smile to your face. And I will guarantee you that some of you had smiles on your face when you were putting in the chat box about, with your memory about the Etch-a-Sketches. Those kind of simple things. It doesn't, you know, you don't need to get a $10 bath bomb or join a gym, which nobody can right now anyways, but just something that is meaningful to you. So keep that in mind with Etch-a-Sketch. I think you can even get one at Target that's like keychain size. Just something to remind you to take a pause between tasks or people that you interact with so you can be clear and present. And you know, these are a lot of kind of examples. Again, most of us do this work because, you know, we want to be the therapist, the advocate, the helper that we didn't have when we were going through this. So a big part of that responsibility, and working with people who are vulnerable, is a huge honor, but it's a bigger responsibility, because most of our credos have something to say about doing no harm. We don't want people in worse shape after they meet with us or after they're involved in our agency than when they came to us, right? So we've really got to know ourselves. We've really got to be in touch with ourselves. Some of us overwork. And a lot of times that overwork, not only is the demand, you know, is connected to the demand of the work that we do, but sometimes we overwork to avoid dealing with ourselves. We stay so busy so we don't have to deal with ourselves. We don't know how to sit in the quiet or sit with ourselves and really think deeply and examine ourselves. And I was afraid of that for a long time. I couldn't be alone, had to be in a relationship, had to be doing something, had to be around a group of friends, had to be at a party, had to be this, that, or the other thing, just to try to fill myself up with that. But my work on myself was about filling myself back in from everything that I lost or covered up through the trauma and the ensuing crisis coping mechanisms I put in place. Some of that stuff like, drinking and doing drugs and overeating and gambling and all that kind of stuff, they'll work for a little bit, but long term, they're not sustainable and they'll end up killing you or breaking you. So the bigger part of our healing from trauma is to examine it, to get to a place, maybe with a trusted person, a therapist or somebody, that we can take it out and examine it. We can understand what the impact of the trauma was on us. Because everybody on this call, like Angie alluded to before, we could have gone, when she talked about her kids in the car crash, we could go through the same trauma, but each and every one of us is going to impact us differently. A lot of times I think we lump everybody in the same kind of bucket. I saw something really great in regards to COVID-19 and this pandemic that we're going through. It said something like, we're not all in the same boat, but we're in the same storm. Because some of the preceding things I'd seen said, we're all in the same boat, hang in there, blah, blah. This one really took it to that next level of understanding. We're not all in the same boat, but we're in the same storm. And when you can get to that kind of understanding about people in crisis, so you're open to what they're actually going through and you don't project your response, your experience, your expectation on that person. One, that's being self-aware, it's being mindful, and it's being open and available. And you're going to be that much more effective with the folks that you serve. So on this slide, it gives you some suggestions other than the bath bombs and those kind of things. Nurturing kindness and attention, patience, focusing on the process, being able to prioritize, and who's in your community, who are your supportive people, right? And then just some for the spring, some other suggestions. When I'm working from home and I can't focus anymore, and I know when I'm looking at an email and I don't even understand what it says, that it's either time for me to go for a walk. And my poor doggie, when I work from home, she goes on 6 or 8 walks a day and she looks at me like, no, not one more walk. I'll sweep the floor, or I'll scrub a piece of tile, or those kind of things. I'll sit and watch the hummingbirds at the hummingbird feeders. Just whatever is a positive thing in your life. So burnout and vicarious trauma limits our ability to provide services and support. So it's normal that we carry the stories of trauma, that it changes our worldview, and it really is normal to be affected by the pain of others. I used to carry the stories home with me, and it got real heavy after a while. And the way I tried to handle that was to work more. And my supervisor caught me about a couple months in, and she asked me, what's your schedule? And I said, well, it's blah, 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 to blah, blah, blah. She said, that adds up to 40 hours, right? I said, yeah. She goes, your timesheet isn't reflecting it, but you've been here 60 hours almost every week for the past 2 months. And I was like all bright and chipper, like, yeah, there's so much to do and I love it here and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And she said, one day you're going to be a really good advocate. And that kind of pricked my ego because I thought I was already being a good advocate. She said, but it's going to be a sad day that one day you won't be able to come into work because you're burnout. And I'm like, what? She goes, you have to leave here and leave all this behind and go home and rest so you can come back fresh and do it again the next day. And if you overwork yourself, you're not going to be able to do that. Then you're going to burn out and we're going to lose you. So I really took that to heart because I didn't want that to happen. And I certainly didn't want to hurt other people. So I'm very visual. So when she was talking about burnout and I was trying to figure that out, that burnt part really stuck with me. So I'm going to ask another question. Erin, watch the chat box. How many of you have ever worked in a fast food restaurant and had the opportunity to clean the deep fat fryer? See if anybody responds to that, Erin.
And I'll share with you, we're getting some great feedback for you of loving that visual. And another comment that says, yes, I love that too. Loving all of this, resonating so well with my soul. Thank you both so much. To your question just now, Doreen, we have not me, yes. And then Rachel shares kind of a sad sideways face. I personally have not had the good fortune of doing that.
Okay, so with that deep fat fryer in place and having to change the oil in that deep fat fryer, hopefully monthly, some places I don't think they did it, but anyways. But if you imagine what's in the bottom of that deep fat fryer. So think about that for a minute. So they visualize the basket, they put the French fries in or the shrimp or whatever, drop into the oil, you know, it cooks up, etc. So any thoughts or ideas, or have you ever seen what's in the bottom of the deep fat fryer?
If folks have seen what's in the bottom of the deep fat fryer, they are not sharing. They are keeping that visual to themselves.
I'll tell you what's in the bottom of the deep fat fryer.
Rosie shares LOL, lots of gunk.
Yeah, lots of gunk, little crunchy, crispy, brown and black, unrecognizable chunks of food. If you don't take care of yourself and you burn out, you are going to resemble the gunk in the bottom of the deep fat fryer. We do not want that. So you need to be aware of how the work is impacting you. Have a great self-care program in place. Work to heal yourself, to do your own internal work. Don't try to heal yourself externally. It never works out. When I get really tearful, so that heightened sensitivity thing here, I know that things are getting to me and I need to step back and rest, because long term, our health, our wellness, our work performance is negatively impacted. So I'm going to give you a couple questions on the next couple of slides so you can start to do this in internal kind of assessment. Do you work harder than you should for your mental and physical health? Because this issue feels deeply personal to you. So again, that might be a gauge on what's happening. So some of you know what burnout is. Some of you have been doing this work for a long time. I'm sure with the 50 plus people we have on this webinar, we've probably got a couple hundred years of experience in the helping professions. And if we had more time, we'd actually add it up. But burnout is a condition of someone who's become very physically and emotionally tired after doing a difficult job for a long time. So in the helping professions, whether you're an advocate in the court or you are in a counseling office, you're doing online support, you do training with people that work in the trenches, any of those kind of things. It's a condition of someone who's become very physically and emotionally tired after doing a difficult job for a long time. That's what we are subject to. That's what we are exposed to in doing this work. So again, here's another little list to kind of do a self-assessment. Do you feel exhausted all the time, even after resting? Lack of motivation sometimes? Frustrated, cynical, other negative emotions? Do you have cognitive problems? Memory. My cognitive problems, that little indicator is when I look at an email and can't even read it anymore. slipping job performance, interpersonal problems at work and at home. Well, right now, mostly it'll just be at home. Not taking care of yourself, being preoccupied with work when you're not at work, generally decreased satisfaction all around, whether it's work or with your coffee or home. And then health problems. Are your health problems flaring up or getting worse? So honestly, answer those questions. If we're not afraid to work with people who have gone through things that most of the general population can't imagine, why then would we hesitate to look at ourselves? In order to effectively...
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I just didn't want to overlook the two comments. Angie had shared, you know, that the physical illness that you just described, that burnout was definitely her, that she was working until she was physically sick. And then Laura shared that she was told by a therapist that she was working in what he called a war zone.
Right. Right. Thank you for those comments. So yes, really be willing and courageous to look at yourself and know yourself. That's where we're going to be the most effective. Understand yourself, look at yourself, know yourself. And if you're experiencing burnout, take relaxation seriously. And whether you take up meditation, like Angie said, some of these things aren't appealing to us. Listening to music. My neighbor got me an Alexis thing at my house. So it's just me and my dog. So I say good morning to her. Sometimes I ask her to a bit of trivia or to define something or play a song. Sometimes I'll ask her to tell me a joke. You know, I read a lot. I take walks. I have a garden, so I play in my garden a lot. Something about having a hose and cleaning off the bricks. I just love that. You know, during this pandemic, my mom's out of state, so I've been calling her instead of twice a week, every night or every other night. Really have that good self-care regimen and relaxation regimen in place and take time for it. You have to invest in you. You know, some of us in the helping profession, we help all kinds of other people and we're at the bottom of the list. But we've got to put ourselves at the top of the list because you can't pour from an empty cup. You got to take care of yourself first. So that's what I've got. Thank you for your time. I guess, Erin, if anybody has questions or comments or complaints for me or Angie or you.
Yeah, if anybody wants to add anything there into the chat box, feel free. Doreen, thank you as always for your fantastic presentation and to both you and Angie for, you know, having the courage and leaning into the vulnerability of sharing a piece of yourself with all of us. I think that there's certainly a lot of power when many of us have had lived experiences, whether it's trauma-based, addiction, violence, grief, loss, all of those types of things. You know, that it really can have an impact on our mental health. And so it's really powerful, I think, when we can come together sort of in unity of some of the pain that many folks have experienced, and certainly not everybody who comes to this field, but know that dealing with our past and our history head on, we know takes a lot of courage. And it's one of the biggest acts of kindness that I think we can offer to ourselves. And then when we go forward to do this work and help individuals through a trauma-informed approach and really meet them where they're at, we can do so in a way that we are not doing the work to heal ourselves, because we want to do that work up ahead of time. But I think we can really show up and be more present and hold space for people and continuing to, you know, to remind ourselves that we want to center our services and our responses around the people that we help. And so again, I'm really grateful to the both of you that you're willing to share a piece of who you are personally and professionally. I hope that today's information was useful for everyone. I know that I took a lot away from it. In the chat box, I have posted the PDF version of today's PowerPoints. I'm also going to follow up with a email to everyone that will include the PowerPoint as well as the evaluation survey. So thank you everyone for spending your morning with us. We appreciate your time. I hope that you all stay emotionally and mentally and physically safe and healthy at home. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Erin. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you, Angie.
Thank you.
Bye, Doreen.
Bye. See ya.